Hi, everybody. Welcome to Workflows 101. Thanks for joining our session this afternoon. My name is Sarah Smith. I'm going to be your presenter and trainer today. I'm happy to say that we have David Rivera here with us. David's a member of our support team, so some of you may have already worked with him on some support tickets. He has been kind enough to agree to be our moderator, so keep an eye on that Q&A. Submit any questions that you have there. David's going to be monitoring that. He'll be answering some of those questions as we go through the session, and then is going to choose a couple of questions to do some Q&A at the end. We'll try to do about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. So anything that occurs to you, feel free to submit those. If you think of something later, we'll definitely let you know how you can contact us after the fact as well. All right, what are we going to talk about today? This is Workflows 101, and as the name implies, we are looking at the real basics, the foundations of workflows and Qualtrics. So in terms of topics, we're going to talk about what is a workflow, make sure we really define and understand that, accessing workflows in Qualtrics, initiating and processing workflow instances, as well as managing and editing our existing workflow definitions. With workflows, it's a really big topic, I know. So an hour, definitely we can't cover everything. So I think it's important to talk about the things we aren't going to be able to cover today. We aren't going to be covering how to create a new workflow in our session today. And we aren't going to be covering some more advanced features like automations or smart restrictions. Don't worry though, there are 3 other sessions focused on workflows. Maybe you've been able to catch some of those. Even if not, we are offering recordings of all of our sessions after the conference. So if you weren't able to check out some of those other workflow sessions, definitely take advantage of those recordings. That's just more content that you are able to access with your registration. With the training, I like to frame our goals in terms of learning objectives. What is it that we hope to learn, to understand, to be able to do as a result of this session? So I've outlined those here. Hopefully everyone at the end of our session understands what a workflow is, understands the basic components, things like steps, routes, custom fields, even responsible parties. Everyone should be able to start or initiate a new workflow or process a step in a workflow. Everyone will be aware of Qualtrics best-in-class workflow offerings if you aren't already, and we'll make sure you understand some of the basic options for workflow administration. And that would include some options that you have for editing your existing workflows. So that's a lot. We want to make sure we dive in so we have plenty of time to discuss. Let's start with what is a workflow? A workflow is just an electronic version of a process. You, I'm sure, have many processes that you utilize. And without a QMS, without Qualtrics, those can be managed in a lot of different ways. Sometimes folks are using spreadsheets, sometimes Post-it notes on your computer monitor, whatever the case might be, to keep track of that process. With a workflow, we're able to do that, of course, electronically, and that's got some nice benefits for us. Using a workflow allows you to manage the process itself. So you can make sure that it's going through the right steps, it's going through the right people, and you're gathering the appropriate and necessary information all along the way. It also gives the added benefit of having all of that data very easily accessible to you so that you're able to access it while you're going through the process, but also at any later date that you need to account for that, either through searching or reporting. So workflows can be a really nice way to support your processes. Pretty much any process you have that you can break down into steps could be a workflow if you choose. The other good news is the Qualtrics workflow module. It's very configurable. So we aren't able to just offer a couple of processes that you're locked into. You can create your own workflows. You can use workflows that folks give to you, and they're very easily customizable. There's a lot of options for that. When I think about workflows, I start to visualize process diagrams, because that's really how I think about a process. Is I think about breaking it down into a diagram. And so I thought it would be helpful as we get started to look at a couple of examples of diagrams that represent Qualtrics workflows. And for this, I'm borrowing these from our best-in-class workflow offering. For anyone who's not aware, Qualtrics offers a set of what we call our best-in-class workflows. And these are workflows that our team has created based on our own experiences with our customers, assisting our customers, some of our employees' own experiences in the field, as well as input from customers and stakeholders. And we've tried to hit on some of the processes that are most commonly desired for workflows, the ones that we hear over and over again that people really want. And the goal was to have something we could offer so folks didn't always have to create those from scratch on their own. People can use them as they are or adjust, edit them as much as is needed. We'll talk about at the end where we can access these. They are available in our customer portal, but I've borrowed just a couple of them here. Starting with our non-conformance report workflow. This is one of what we call our universal workflows out of the best-in-class. The universal workflows are ones that are relevant across multiple industries. So we know that various types of organizations need a way to report their non-conformances and evaluate those. That's what this is. This one is on the more basic side in terms of its construction. You can see that there are only 4 steps. Each of these shapes represents a different step in the process, and it's a very linear process. Each step just goes to the next one after the other, and you can only work forward in that linear fashion. So what we see here in our diagram are 2 of the basic building blocks of a workflow. First one, steps. As I said, each of these shapes represents a different step in the process, which is also a step in our workflow. The other main building block that we see here are what we call routes. These are represented by the arrows, and a route is just a way to get from one step to the next in a workflow. So let's take a peek at another one. This is our audit management workflow, and this one is starting to add a little bit of complexity. We've got more steps than in the previous. And for the first time, we're seeing that we can actually route back to a previous step in a workflow if needed. So while the first one we looked at was very linear, that's not a requirement for workflows in any way. You can combine your steps and routes to go through a process in whatever order you might need. Here we're taking a look at our corrective action workflow. So we're seeing some new elements here. We're not only seeing multiple steps, we have the ability to route back to a previous step if needed. We also have a step where there are multiple routes or options from the same step. So the effectiveness review has 3 different possibilities for the next step depending on what you're discovering through the process itself. So we're able to use these same building blocks of steps and routes and combine them together in really a wide variety of processes. And what I'd like to do is now hop into our demo site and start to talk about what this looks like in Qualtrics itself. I'm using a demo site that we're just using with our trainers during these sessions, but it's a good time to remind everyone, hopefully you're already aware, that we do have a demo site that we're offering to everyone who's attending the conference. That URL is QUC2021.qualtricscloud.com. I'm going to include that in my slides. There's not a ton of information in my slides, but it does include our agenda that I just showed you. So I am going to post that in the Attendee Hub so that you have that along with the recording. I'm going to make sure to link to just a couple of resources as well as the demo site for you. And everyone is going to be able to log into that site using their email address as both their username and password. And that's going to be the email address that you used when you registered for this conference. So everything that I'm showing you, everything that you've learned in this session, as well as all of your other sessions, if you want to get in there and explore and try that out in the demo site, it's a great idea before you look to apply some of that knowledge in your production site. It's a nice little sandbox environment for you. All right, so first question as we're in Qualtrics itself is how do we access workflows? We've already defined what they are. How do we get to them? How do we use them? And in this case, the answer depends on what specifically we're trying to do. So right now I want to distinguish between being an end user of a workflow. And what I mean by that is being the person who either starts or initiates that workflow or the person who completes one of the steps. And that is going to be different than being a workflow administrator and looking to manage or edit your existing workflows. So I'm going to separate those two out, and the answer to how we access workflows changes depending on our goal. We're going to start with the end user perspective. What do we do if we want to start a new workflow, kick it off, or if we are responsible for completing a step in a workflow? So first thing I'm going to do here in the main menu options on the left is I'm going to click on workflows. So this is where we're going to come if we need to initiate a process. We need to start a new instance of a workflow. And what I see when I click on the workflows menu option is I see a list of all of the workflows that I have the ability or the access needed to start or to initiate. This is not a comprehensive list of all of the workflows in my system necessarily. It's only the ones that my workflow admins have configured to allow me to start or to initiate. Sometimes there are certain processes that you want everyone in the organization to be able to do, to initiate. Something like a non-conformance report, very commonly you want everyone to be able to report a possible non-conformance. For other workflows, you may want only folks that have been specially trained or only people who are interested or that it's relevant to. And it's the workflow administrators who have the ability to specify that. When we get into the admin side, I'm going to show you where that configuration is so that if you are that workflow admin and you need to make some tweaks, you'll have the ability to do so. Right now, I'm going to say for the purpose of this training that we would like to go and use the customer feedback workflow. So I'm going to click customer feedback. And it's going to take me to the first step in the customer feedback workflow. The first step, as we can see here at the top, is new customer feedback received. And if I scroll to the bottom here, I'm going to see a diagram for this workflow. This one has 5 steps, really 3 that are going to require us to populate information. And we can see that the process is designed to allow us to document the feedback, submit it for a review. During that review, whoever's responsible will determine whether a corrective action is needed and launch a corrective action if so, and whether or not a corrective action is needed, determine what type of actions might need to be taken and who may be responsible for that. Then it'll go for the person who's responsible for taking action to do so. That might mean working with the customer, it might mean investigating. They're going to be responsible for taking those actions, documenting them, and then closing out the workflow. So that's really what this process is all about, taking the customer feedback, documenting it, reviewing, responding to it, and then closing so that you have that record. Each step is just a page in your workflow. So you can see we have a page here and it's all our current step, which is new customer feedback received. The page is made up of a variety of custom fields. And these are custom fields like you're probably familiar with using in documents or with personnel. They live under administration in custom fields. That's where all of our custom fields are created and where they live. But these have been configured for use in this workflow. And if I'm the person who is completing this step, in this case, the first step, I just need to populate these fields to represent the actions I've taken to complete this particular step in the process. We offer a variety of field types that you can put together in a lot of different combinations. So as I'm going through this sample workflow, what I'll do is just make sure to point out along the way what type of field we're dealing with so you get an idea for how these look and operate in the workflow itself. So first thing, who actually submitted this feedback? So let's say for this one, it's Joan Hodges gave us this feedback and her company name is Hodges Incorporated. Those are both text fields. They're single line text fields and I can type in that information. And let's see, we're going to put in some contact information here. You can see that this is also a text field. This one, however, is multi-line because we're anticipating more information. You might also notice that some fields are required and others are not. And that's also part of the configuration that your workflow admins can adjust or update if needed. If it's required, it's going to show you that in orange so that you're aware. And you need to make sure that at a minimum, you're populating those required fields. If you have more information, of course, you want to populate the other fields as well, but at a minimum, you need those requireds. All right, so far we've had 3 text fields. Now we're hitting one that says customer feedback received by, and it has a link for show available users. So we've hit our first personnel field here. That's what this is. If I click show available users, I'm going to get a list of users in this Qualtrics system. So I'm actually going to look for myself here. You might notice that there are individual users as well as Qualtrics groups in this personnel field. All right. So personnel fields allow you to pick from users in the Qualtrics system. Next field asks me for what type of feedback was received. And this has a drop down that lets me know I'm dealing with a list field. List fields have list values and you can choose from them in a drop down list. I'm going to say we got some negative feedback in this instance. Next, date feedback received. So this one is a date time field. I can tell because it says show calendar. So I'm going to click on that and select my date. I'm going to say Friday was when we received this feedback. And now we have another text field that's asking us to give as much detail as possible about the feedback that was received from Joan. So I'm going to say Joan Hodges called on Friday, 9/17 to report she has not yet received her report. She was told it would be delivered via email by Wednesday, 9/15. She'd like to know why it wasn't delivered and to get the report as soon as possible. All right, so you want to give as much as you can so that whoever's going to review this knows exactly what's going on, as much detail as you can. And then there is an option to attach feedback, or sorry, documentation if necessary, feedback documentation. And this is what we would call an external file field. External file fields allow you to attach a file to the workflow. So if you had a situation where there was a picture or a report or any kind of document, you could attach that using this. So that's all you have to do to complete a step in a workflow. Of course, some of that might require some work outside of the system that you would then document in your fields. So you want to keep an eye on that. But we go through, complete everything that's a part. And then when we're ready, we want to use the route to get to the next step. So if we look at our diagram, we see there is a route connecting this to the only possible next step. Sometimes there can be more than one route, but here we just have one taking us to feedback review. And that route is represented by the button on the bottom of the page. So if the page itself represents the step, the button, or sometimes buttons on the bottom, represent any routes that you can take to get to another step. When I click on this route button, it's going to save everything that I've entered and then process me forward to that next step. One exception, if any of the required fields have been left empty, it will give me a warning and let me know that I need to populate that before it can move forward. But I've entered everything, so when I click, we should move forward, no problem, to the next step in this workflow. So here we are on feedback review. Now this came immediately to me and opened the next step, and I'm right in the step, I'm right in the page. The reason for that is even though I was the workflow initiator, that's what we call the person who starts a new workflow instance, I'm also assigned to the second step, which is the review. And I did that on purpose today just so that I could show you each step. But in reality, that's probably not going to be the case. The person that submits the feedback is not going to be the person necessarily that reviews it. So this is a good time to start talking about how do we access a workflow if we're not the person who's starting it, but instead we've been assigned to a step in that workflow. We are responsible for a step and we need to complete it. Good news is that answer is really easy. It's going to be a task in your inbox. So I'm going to click on my inbox. And you can see it right here in the middle. This didn't exist before I started this workflow and got to this step. I have a task that tells me I'm responsible for the feedback review. And you can see it's grouped or categorized by the workflow. So I have a feedback review to do for the customer feedback. And if I click on that task, it's going to take me there. You might wonder why there's also another task here. The reason for that is when you are the workflow initiator, you're going to have a task in your inbox for that workflow until it reaches its close or completion step. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have anything that you're responsible for doing. You may or may not. It's just a facet of the system that if you initiate a workflow, you're able to track that through to completion. So anytime you have a task to complete, all you have to do is look in your inbox, click on that step, the link for the task associated with that step, and it takes you right here, same way that we saw earlier. If we're going to review this feedback, first thing we see is we see a section on feedback details. And this is all of the information that was submitted by the workflow initiator in step 1. It's not editable anymore. And that's something that workflow admins can configure, is whether on each step a field is just viewable or also editable. Here, these have clearly been made view only. So my responsibility is not to edit or update that ever, but I do need to be able to view it because my job is to review that feedback. So I need to know what it is. I need all the information. Once I do, my next section is to review those details. So first, what are my comments regarding the feedback? So I might say something like, I checked our systems and confirmed that the report was sent on Tuesday, 9/14. I would suggest we work with Joan to see if the email was blocked or we need to use an alternate delivery method. Right, so Joan says she didn't get a report. I check our systems, I can see it was sent. So what happened? Maybe it's in her junk folder. Maybe her organization blocks attachments. For whatever reason, she may not have gotten that. I need to dig in and see, and then figure out how I can get it to her. Is that an adjustment she can make on her side to allow it to come through? Do I need to maybe use Dropbox or another method instead of email? Whatever the case might be. And then I'm going to select an owner to address the feedback. So who is it that's going to work with Joan to figure this out and make sure we get to a resolution? In this case, this is a personnel field. I'm just going to choose myself again to keep everything circling back to me. But you would be able to potentially choose a different person. So just because you're the one reviewing doesn't mean you have to do the next step, which would be, tackling any necessary actions. The final thing I'm responsible for when I am reviewing this feedback are corrective action details if needed. And when I read the description here, it lets me know that this section is one that I need to fill out if this feedback means that we need a corrective action. And if we do, then I need to fill out what we call a subform. You can see it's labeled here. This one is our non-conformance subform. So a subform is a new field type that we haven't talked about yet. It's a field that's made up of other fields grouped together in a row. So this subform has 6 different fields: date field, list field, standards field, a couple of text fields, and an external file field. But they're all grouped together here in one kind of parent field that's in a row format, and you can even add additional rows if needed. So if in reviewing this format, I realize we actually have a couple of different non-conformances that each need their own corrective action, I could do rows to represent that. In our scenario today, we don't need this. There's nothing here that's telling me we need a corrective action. We've just got some kind of issue that's prevented her from receiving her report, and we want to figure that piece out, but we don't need a corrective action. So I'm going to leave this blank. you can see here that from feedback review, it'll launch a corrective action if needed, but if not, it'll just go to the next step, which is actions taken. So I'm going to click feedback reviewed. And it's taken me back to my inbox. I don't have a task yet. And the reason is the system is just working to process that last step. It's checking to see if a corrective action is needed. And so all I have to do is just refresh my inbox. It just took it an extra second to do that processing behind the scenes. And so when I refresh, now I'm here and I have a task for that next step, which is actions taken. I'm going to click on that. All right. So if I look at the diagram at the bottom, we're here. It's the final step before close. And as the person responsible for this step, I'm going to be able to review the feedback that initially came in, review all of the review details. So what were the comments, and if there was corrective action, I can look at the details of that. And then my job is to describe the actions taken. Now, what that obviously means is that offline, I've needed to take some actions. And here, I'm just going to be documenting those and describing those. So let's say I called Joan today, and that's going to be 9/21. We determined that the email address she used or provided had an error. Resent. She confirmed receipts by email. All right, so this one was a pretty easy one. There's just an error in the email. We may have some additional actions taken here. If we've got a system where that incorrect email was being stored, we might need to update that, whatever the case might be. But what we've done here is we've made sure that we've addressed the feedback. Joan's happy, she's got a report, we know what the issue was. If there's any supporting documentation we can attach, if there's any staff we need to notify, we've got that here in a personnel field. When were the actions implemented? It says the call was today. Date customer notified, same, because it was a phone call, it was all in one. And then do we have any documentation of that customer notification? If it's maybe by email or some type of document, we could attach. And then our final route is going to take us to close or complete. So now the workflow is done. We've taken it from beginning to end. We've tracked that feedback all the way from receiving it through any actions and resolving. And we're done with the process. And we now have a record of having gone through that for that particular feedback. A natural next question would be, well, where is that data? How can I access that? And there's two ways that you can access data about your workflow instances. And that's going to be through searching or reporting. So I want to make sure to point both of those out to you. Search functionality is going to be here at the top. We've got a search bar. And if I click on advanced, I get to choose from my workflows. I'm going to choose customer feedback, which is the same one that we were just taking a look at. And this is going to allow me to search for any instances of the customer feedback workflow that I'd like. Now, what you've heard me say several times is to refer to a workflow instance. So I think that it's important to define what it is we mean when we talk about a workflow instance. So every time you initiate a workflow and you go through that workflow collecting data, that's a workflow instance, right? So there's one template of a workflow. There's one configuration of a workflow. We call that a workflow definition, but then you can use that same workflow definition and you can have as many instances as you need. Every time you get feedback and you enter it into the system, that's starting a new instance, and each one of those has its own ID and its own data associated with it. So we can search here for all of the instances that meet our criteria. If I just hit search without setting any criteria, I'll see all instances, or I can narrow it down. Maybe I only want to see feedback that's positive or negative. Maybe I only want to see feedback that was received during a certain time frame. Whatever criteria you want to use to narrow your results, you can. and then you just hit search. It's going to give you a list of your results that match your search criteria. In this case, it's a list of all customer feedback workflow instances. For each one, you're going to see basic information, ID, title, step, and so on. And you can export this information in the upper right if you need to. Now, search is really good when you're just looking for something and, it's not necessarily something you need to run a lot over time, or you're not in need of specific information. Those scenarios are better left to reports, which we'll look at in a moment. But if you're just quickly looking for something, search can be really nice. You are locked into the information that's displayed here. So if there's information in that workflow that you would prefer to see in a grid view, really would want to look at a report. Under ID, each of the IDs here is a clickable link to that workflow instance. And if you have access to view instances of the workflow, you can click that link and it will take you to the current step. Now for this one, the workflow is closed. So we're on the very last step. We never saw that when we were going through the workflow, but it's still there. That's where the workflow ended up. And so we see this step and we see any fields that are viewable on this particular step. If we had chosen a workflow that was still open, then it would take us to the current step that workflow was on at the moment. In this view, we can see a printable version, and we can also have the option to delete this workflow instance. Now that's a pretty powerful tool because obviously that's going to get rid of any data that you've collected as you went through the process that time. And so reminder that the ability to delete is based on a permission. You have to have the data retention permission in order to delete items. It will give you a couple of warnings and make you confirm extra when you're deleting, because that is a step that you can't undo. In terms of why you would want to delete a workflow instance, honestly, the most common reason I can think of is when you are testing. So if you're creating a workflow for the first time, or you've made some tweaks and you want to test it and make sure everything works as you would expect, then you may want to go back and delete those instances that you did just for testing, because that data isn't real data that you need. You might not want it included in your search and in your reports. Other than that, I would use that delete pretty sparingly, because again, you're deleting any data that's associated with that workflow instance. So that's searching. Let's talk about reporting now. Reports have their own main menu option over here on the left, just under workflows actually. And some benefits of reporting over, say, a search is you get to define which fields are included in your report, and you can save reports so that they can be run over and over. You can even create instances of reports that can be delivered by email on a regular basis rather than you having to run reports. We're not going to get into all the nitty-gritty of reports because we really want to spend our time on workflows here. But I do want to point out that there are some system reports for workflows. System reports are reports that are included in everyone's Qualtrics system upon install. Our current one is standard workflow reports. If I run that, I just want to acknowledge for everyone that the standard workflow reports are very high level. They're very broad. And that's really intentional. It's by necessity. For instance, if I look at the status report for today, it will show me the number of workflow instances in each step of the workflow. Right, that's really high level. It's not telling me anything about those instances. I can't look at any fields. It's just a real overview. The reason that these have to be so broad is they have to be designed to be used with any workflow in your system. And as I hope you've already seen, workflows can be really varied. They're each going to have their own steps, their own routes, their own fields. So having a report that works just as well for one workflow as another, that's tricky. You have to be really broad in order to do that. For that reason, a lot of people like to get into some custom reporting for their workflows. So if I go back to reports, Our custom workflow reports are going to be in the workflow tab, right? And these will allow you to be really specific, to choose a single workflow and create a report that includes whatever information you would like for that workflow. So you can get into the specific custom fields that that workflow has that maybe other workflows don't. We do have a sample one here for customer feedback, so I'm going to run that. There's a couple of filter options if I want to filter, but I'm just going to run the full report. So here you can see, again, we're looking at a grid format, but this time, whoever created this report had the ability to pick which fields were going to be included in the report. And because of that, it's very specific to the customer feedback workflow. It's presenting me the type of feedback, the customer, the feedback details, and so on. Good news is, as long as you include ID as your field for workflows, there will still be a clickable link there where you can access that workflow instance. You can export your results if needed. And so when you're thinking about your workflows, you have the ability to create custom reports if needed, as long as you have access. And if you have an existing report and you need to make tweaks, you can always go into the report designer. And that will allow you to make any changes to the fields that are included in your report, the filters that you want to include, that sort of thing. All right, so we have covered a lot. And now we want to turn our attention to the admin side of things. So far, we've been sticking to what's it like as a user of workflows, to start them, to process a step, to try to access data. Now let's talk about all those things that I said admins can do or are decided by your admins. Where do you go if that's you, if you're the workflow admin and you want to take care of some of those things? And the answer is we want to go to Workflows Administration. And that's under the administration option in your main menu. So here on the left, I'm going to click administration, all the way to the bottom, workflows. First things first, this is permissions dependent. So to even have the workflows administration option, you have to have the workflows administration permission. If you look in your production site and you can't choose workflows under administration, probably just means you don't have the permission. If you think that's an error, you'll just want to talk to your Qualtrics admin or someone who has access to add that permission to your account, because it is explicitly tied to that permission. Once we're here, let's talk about what we can do in Workflows admin. We can create new workflows. We can import and export workflows. And then the area we're going to focus in today, this is also where you can manage and make edits to your existing workflow definitions. So that's what I want to focus on with you. And I specifically want to look at the customer feedback workflow that we've been using throughout our session. So I'm going to click on that. And here we are in our workflow definition. So remember, as I previously mentioned, our two terms that we want to familiarize ourselves with are workflow definitions and workflow instances. Everything we've done so far today has really been focused on the workflow instance, starting a new instance, processing a step, viewing the data. Now we've turned our attention to the definition, and the workflow definition is the template for the workflow. It's where we set all of the configuration. It's where we set the steps, the routes, the fields, the responsible parties, and all of our instances. The behavior of those instances follows the configuration we've set up in the definition here. When we look here, everything is read-only. It looks very static. And the reason is that this workflow is online. I can see there's an option to take it offline in the upper left. As long as it's online, you can start a new instance. You can process a step if that's been assigned to you, but you can't make changes. So everything here in the definition, read only, no changes allowed. If I need to make adjustments, I need to take it offline. Now, if you're in that boat and you need to make some changes, you'll want to consider maybe timing that to try to have it offline for the minimum amount of time absolutely necessary, and at a time where you're interrupting things not interrupting things any more than you need to. Because again, as long as it's offline, no one's going to be able to start a new instance and no one's going to be able to move any of the open instances forward. And that's not going to open back up until you put the workflow back online. So if you're working on a new workflow, try to do all that prep, up front before you take that workflow live and have folks really using it in the field, if at all possible. Once I took it offline, lots of things become editable here. So it looks very different, but it's all the same information, just that allows us to make edits and updates. Rather than digging into some of the workflow definition settings that affect the workflow as a whole, I'd like first to look at our steps, which are all located here on the left side of our screen. And I'm going to click on the very first step in this workflow. These steps should look really familiar because they're the same steps we went through when we were, going through an instance of this workflow. And when we click on a step, on the right side, we're going to see all of the information and configuration that exists at the step level. So that's what I'd like to go through with you first. What are the things that we can do and what are the things that are important for each step that's in your workflow? So first of all, each step has a name. You can, of course, update that if needed. Then the first really big concept we want to talk about here are responsible parties. This is a really important concept for workflows. Responsible parties are the people who are responsible for that step in a workflow. Now, I had to leave that a little general because the specific explanation is a little bit different for the first step in a workflow than it is for every other step in a workflow. Let me explain what I mean by that. We're here on the first step and we've got a variety of responsible parties. On the first step, your responsible parties are the people who can start or initiate a new instance of the workflow. So think back to what I said a little bit earlier in this session. I said when I clicked on the workflow's main menu option, the list I saw was all of the workflows that were available to me as a user to start or to initiate. And that was controlled by my workflow admins. Well, here's where it's controlled. For each of your workflows, the people who are responsible parties on step one are the people who can start or initiate that workflow. If you need to change that, you just click Open Options beside responsible parties, and you can add any additional groups as responsible parties. If it's a workflow that anyone in your whole organization should be able to start, then you could even use all users, and that would mean anyone in the system could start or initiate that workflow. I want to point out that the system will allow you to pick individual users as responsible parties. I would highly recommend that you stick to using groups. And I know that we probably all sound like broken records in our sessions. We say that all the time, but it really is in your best interest. If you use a group, then you can actually update your responsible parties just by adding and removing people from the group. You don't have to take the workflow offline in order to do that. If, however, you are using an individual user, then if there's a personnel change, you're going to have to take every workflow offline that person is a responsible party for and go in and switch them out in every step where they're identified as a responsible party. It's more work, it's kind of clunky, and it forces you to take your workflow offline. None of those things are very fun. So to avoid that, even if it's a one-person group, we really recommend using groups. So that's how you would add a responsible party. And then if you need to remove a responsible party, you just use the remove option to the right of their name. On every other step, the responsible party is going to be the person that step is explicitly assigned to. So when you get to that step in the workflow, those people are going to get a task in their inbox, letting them know they have a step to complete that they're responsible for. So same basic concept, but just operates a little bit differently in that first step because of the nature of a first step. You can't explicitly assign it. Instead, you just have to say who can kick off this process. And then from there on, you can explicitly assign each step to a group or to groups. There's also the concept of collaborators. It doesn't really make sense for a first step, but for every other step, Collaborators are people who can contribute information, they can edit fields on that step, but they cannot route that workflow forward to the next step. That has to be a responsible party. So this isn't always necessary, but there are situations where you'll say, you know what, the responsible party, they're the ones that need to complete this step, but there's one piece of information that someone else is going to need to fill in for them. Or we want someone else to be able to consult on a couple of fields. That might be a great use for collaborators if you need them. All right, so back on step one, so far we've talked about kind of the who in steps, who is responsible for a particular step, and that is assigned through responsible parties and collaborators. Now let's talk about fields. So I've got on my first step here a new fields for this step section. And below that, I have a list of all of the fields that have been added to this step in this workflow. For each custom field, we get to see the type, and then we get to use checkboxes to determine whether that field is viewable and or editable at that particular step in the workflow. We can make adjustments here if we need to change which ones are viewable and editable. We can also change the order if needed by adjusting the numbers here in the order column. You might wonder why there are so many fields here in the first step, especially because so many of them are not either viewable or editable. And the answer to that is we actually internally have a best practice of putting all fields in the first step of a workflow. We just think it makes life easier when you're managing your workflows for all of the fields to be all coming from one step. Because let me show you step number 2. After the first step, fields are divided into new fields for this step versus fields from other steps. We just internally tend to prefer that they not be divided into those two categories so that we have the maximum flexibility for reordering and putting things in whatever order visually that we would like. That's really the only reason. There's nothing that says you have to do it that way, but you will notice in our workflows that we tend to do that. It's true in all of our best in class, at least our current versions, and it's something we've pretty much standardized on with our internal staff. So obviously, as you've seen when we went through a workflow, custom fields are really important. And so you may at times need to adjust not just whether it's viewable, editable, the order, but sometimes you might need to add or remove fields in order to continue getting the information that you need. You absolutely can do that. If you need to remove a field, there is a remove option. You can click that and it will be removed from the workflow. I would, however, recommend that you think about whether there's historical data associated with that field. So if you've been using the workflow and there's been data that's been collected, then you probably don't want to remove the field. In that case, you probably just want to uncheck both view and edit, save that change. You'll still have that field in the workflow that you can use to access historical data if you want to include it in reports and things, but you won't continue to see that or have that be populated moving forward. So those are your two options for getting rid or removing a field. Let's talk about adding a field. Let's say there's information you need to gather that's not, covered by your existing fields. You can do that as well. As a reminder, all custom fields live under administration in custom fields. That has its own permission. So if you're a workflows admin, I would definitely recommend you make sure you're also a custom fields admin. I'm going to open this in a new tab. Here are all of our custom fields. These are all the ones that already exist in our system, organized by type. If the custom field that you want to include in your workflow has already been created, it's already there in that custom fields area, then you can click Open Options just to the right of New Fields. And that same list is there. You just find your field and add it. However, it's not always possible. Sometimes you're working and you realize I need a new field and I haven't already created that. So what can I do? You can go to custom fields and you can create it and then come back and choose open options and look for it. You may need to refresh your screen. Or here at the bottom, you can create your new field directly here. And then give it a type. When you do that, it will be added here to the bottom of that fields list, and you can do all of the same adjustment and editing that you can for other fields, view, edit, reorder, and so on. Now, if it's, say, a list field, you're still later going to have to come back to custom fields and do a little more configuration. So I'm going to look for that sample field. I'm going to have to do some list values here, right? So I still might have to come and do a little more. I might have to decide whether a text field is multi-line or single line, whether a list value is multi-select or single select. But I can get it in, I can have it here as a placeholder, as well as be able to start configuring it in the workflow. And later I can do that work in custom fields without actually having to be in the workflow itself. I'm just going to remove this field that I just threw in. All right, so that's steps. Steps are where we choose our responsible parties, our collaborators, where we choose and configure all of our fields that we're going to use. Each step has at least one route. So I'm going to click to expand my step here, and the route will appear underneath. So I'm going to click on that and talk about what's set at the route level. With a route, we get to decide whether we just need one responsible party or all. So remember, you can pick a lot of different people as responsible parties. Most of the time, you're saying, I just need at least one of these people to complete this step and then process the workflow forward. That's the one responsible party option, and it's the default, it's most common. But if you ever need all of those people to complete the workflow before you want to allow it to move forward, you can use the all responsible parties option. The route is also where you decide which fields are required. So if I see what's required for route, these are the ones that are chosen already. I can remove any of these if I no longer want them to be required, or I can click open options if there are other fields being used in this workflow that I think should be a required field. A lot of times people assume those are going to be at the step level where we're choosing which fields are viewable and editable. But it's intentionally here at the route level that we do the requirements, because from the same step, you could have multiple routes that are going to a variety of different next steps. And the information that's required for each of those might be a little bit different. So we want you to be able to adjust what you make required depending on the route that's taking you to your next step. You also, for each route, can have an email action, and there'll be a link to it here. Those email actions live in email actions admin, just like all email actions do. But we like to have a link to them here because we know there are a lot and it can be a little bit tricky to bounce back and forth. So it's just for ease of access and reference. Now I'm going to go back to workflow definition settings, and these are the things that impact the workflow definition as a whole that we want to mention. One thing is, I told you that the workflow diagram appeared in the footer because we configured it that way. So here's what that configuration looks like. One is the diagram has to be attached to the workflow definition. And I can see it is here because there's a view option that lets me take a look. And as long as that diagram is attached and I can see the ability to view, then at the bottom with HTML headers and footers, I can open that up. And here's the HTML that we can use to display that diagram in the footer of the workflow. I'm going to include this HTML in my slides that I have loaded for you to access. The only thing you have to do is you have to update the ID. So this one is 2859. That just matches my workflow ID here. So if you use that in your own workflows, you just need to make sure, number one, you've attached your diagram. If you're not sure how to do that, I believe that's being covered in one of our other workflow sessions and creating new workflows. And then you need to make sure you update the ID in that HTML. Every workflow has to have a beginning and an end step. You can add extra password verification by checking this box. If you do, when someone goes to process a step in a workflow, they're going to be prompted for their Qualtrics username and password again. So just some extra verification. You can disable the alter workflow instances permission. That permission is a global permission that lets whoever has it alter any instance of a workflow. One of the things that means is if you have that permission, when you look at a workflow, every field looks editable. We think sometimes that can be a little bit confusing because it's unclear what you're meant to populate and what is just there for you to view. And so we often, with our best in class workflows, go ahead and disable that permission. You can see it's checked here, just to make it more clear. But that is up to you for each workflow that you have. And then you get to decide who can access your workflow, your definition, and your instances. For instances, you want to think about who needs to maybe search and run reports, because if you can't view the instances, then when you search and run reports, there's not going to be anything for you to view. So that's what you want to think about here. Definition is where we are now. So it might seem crazy that all users have view and edit security here. But remember, to even get to this area, you're going to have the permission. So it's really just saying anyone with the permission can do that. All right, so we've packed a lot of information in. I'm going to have these slides added to Attendee Hub for you. I've got some resources. There's some nice workflow videos, handouts. We also, in our support portal, have all of our best in class workflows and a configuration guide. And I've also added in that HTML for adding your diagram to footers. So that'll all be there for you if you're interested. And just remember, you can practice in the demo site anything that we've learned today or from any of your sessions. So we've got a couple of minutes left for some Q&A. Let's check in with David and see if we have any questions that folks have asked.
Thanks, Sarah. We do have a question. Under responsible parties, we noticed under a custom field, there was a value that said false. Can you tell us a little bit about what that exactly means?
So with your responsible parties, you have the ability to, and actually, it might be nice if I come back in. I mentioned that you could choose groups. One thing that I didn't mention was on your other steps, you are able to choose not only from groups, but you can choose a custom field. So you can say whoever was identified in a personnel field in a previous step, make them the responsible party on another step. You can also choose a workflow initiator, but it's a way basically to say whoever we identified earlier, now they're responsible for the next step in the process or a later step. So when you talk about custom fields as responsible parties, that's what we're referring to.
Thank you, Sarah. Well,
yeah.
Like you said, that was a lot of content, a lot of great content. I did want to remind our users, however, if they can think of any other questions, after the conference, they can definitely reach out to support. The email is support@qualtrics.com, and we'd be happy to, answer any questions they have there.
Awesome. Well, thanks, David, for keeping an eye on that Q&A. Thank you to all of you for attending. I hope that you're having a great day. We still got a final session left. Definitely let us know if questions pop up after. Definitely take advantage of all the recordings we're going to be sharing. And we just really appreciate you taking the time. So everybody have a great afternoon and thanks so much.
Thanks.